A man who had everything: a loyal wife, a loving home, beautiful children, and a future full of promise. He chose to throw it all away for strangers, for parties, for the kind of women who only show up when there is money on the table. He spent years running from the best thing that ever happened to him, chasing shadows and calling it success, wearing his lifestyle like a badge of honor while his wife cried alone behind closed doors. But life has a way of bringing every man back to the truth, not gently, and not at a time of his choosing. Sometimes it takes hitting the very bottom before a man finally looks up and sees who was always standing there. This is that story. And if you are watching this right now, pay very close attention, because what happened to Daniel Carter could happen to any man who puts the world before his family. Daniel Carter grew up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everybody knows your name and your grandmother's name and probably what you had for dinner on a Tuesday. He was the second of 4 children, raised by a mother who worked double shifts at the county hospital and a father who repaired engines in a garage that smelled like motor oil and old coffee. They were not rich, but they were together, and Daniel watched his parents hold their family unit like it was sacred ground. He grew up believing that was the standard. He grew up thinking he understood exactly what a family was supposed to look like. But understanding something in theory and actually living it out when the pressure comes, those are 2 very different things, and Daniel would spend the next 2 decades learning that lesson the painful way. He met Michelle in technical college during their 2nd year. She was studying architectural drafting, and he was in mechanical engineering. And the first time he saw her, she was arguing with a professor about load-bearing calculations, with the kind of quiet confidence that made everyone in the room pay attention, whether they wanted to or not. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform. She simply laid out the facts with a precision that left the professor with no reasonable response except to concede she was right. Daniel sat in the back of that lecture hall and watched her gather her notes and walk out, and something in him shifted in a way that he would not be able to explain clearly for years afterward. He did not know her name yet. He did not know anything about her except what he had just witnessed. But he knew, with the certainty that only comes once or twice in a lifetime, that this woman was going to matter. They became friends, the way that real love always starts slowly, without a formal beginning. Through late-night study sessions that ran past midnight, and arguments about music and food and the right way to solve a problem, and long walks across campus that were never officially anything but felt like everything, Michelle Tanner was not a woman who needed impressing. She was a woman who needed honesty, and she could identify the difference between a man who had it and a man who was performing it from considerable distance. She pushed Daniel in ways no one had ever pushed him. She challenged his assumptions without cruelty. She laughed at his jokes but never let him be lazy, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, without a single dramatic declaration, they both understood that what was growing between them was not going to fit in the category of friendship for much longer. Daniel Carter fell in love with Michelle Tanner the way serious things happen gradually, completely, and without any road back to before. They graduated in the same year and married 18 months later at a small ceremony in Columbus on a Saturday afternoon in October when the Ohio leaves had turned gold and rust and the air carried that particular quality that belongs only to autumn beginnings. Michelle wore a dress she and her mother had designed together. Daniel wore a suit that had cost him 3 weeks of savings. Their vows were not rehearsed or polished. They were specific and honest, and everyone present understood that these 2 people meant every single word. Gloria Carter cried in the front row. Robert Carter, Sr., sat beside her with a jaw so tight with pride that his face told the whole story without requiring any words. It was the kind of wedding people remember, not because it was elaborate, but because it was real, and real is a far rarer thing than any decoration can manufacture. The early years were full in the particular way of people who are building something from nothing together and finding joy in the process rather than only in the destination. A small apartment painted pale yellow on a Sunday afternoon that ended with both of them covered in paint and unable to stop laughing. Grocery budgets split to the dollar. One trip per year to somewhere neither of them had been, saved for carefully and treated like an adventure. Their son Marcus arrived 3 years in, and Daniel held that boy in the delivery room and felt something open in his chest that he had not known was closed. 18 months later, their daughter Amara came into the world, named for both of their mothers, and the family felt complete in a way that is nearly impossible to articulate to someone who has not stood in that particular room and felt the full weight of what has just become possible. Those were the golden years. And the quiet tragedy of golden years is that the man living them almost never recognizes them for what they are until they are already behind him. The job offer came when Marcus was 4 years old, a global logistics company with operations across the United States, Europe, and parts of West Africa, a salary nearly 3 times his current earnings. A travel schedule that would take him out of the country multiple times per year. By every conventional measure, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. Daniel and Michelle sat at their kitchen table for 2 evenings and talked about it honestly, the way they had always talked about everything. She had concerns, and she raised them plainly. The travel was aggressive. The children were young. And the foundation they had spent years laying carefully was still relatively new and not yet tested by the kind of sustained pressure this would introduce. Daniel heard her. He promised this was a means to an end. He promised that no matter what cities the job took him through, she and the children would always be the center of everything. Michelle believed him not because she was naive, but because the man sitting across from her at that kitchen table had spent years earning her belief. She could not have known that the man who would come back from those first international trips would not be entirely the same man who left. The first change was subtle enough to dismiss. Daniel returned from his initial trip to Dubai with a different energy, not visibly bad, but noticeably altered. In the way a person is altered when they have tasted a version of the world that makes their ordinary life feel insufficient by comparison. He had moved through airport lounges and 5-star hotels and rooftop business dinners, surrounded by people who lived at a scale he had never witnessed up close, and something about that exposure got under his skin in a way he had not anticipated and did not know how to handle. The money was real. The access was real. And the feeling it produced, the feeling that the boy from small-town Ohio was finally standing in the room he was always meant to be in, was intoxicating. The trips became more frequent, then longer. Within 2 years, Daniel was traveling more than he was home, and what had begun as professional necessity was quietly becoming preference. Because out there, in London and Lagos and Amsterdam and Atlanta, there were no school pickups or bedtime routines, or a wife who saw him clearly and completely. Out there, he could be whoever he wanted. He could be the successful international man, the well-traveled executive with the easy confidence and the generous tab and the network that spanned 3 continents. And in that version of himself, there was no space for the quiet accountability of a family who knew him before any of it. Michelle noticed the distance before Daniel was even fully aware of it himself. She noticed the way attentive wives always notice, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small ones, each individually explainable, but together forming a pattern too consistent to ignore. The calls that once came every evening became every other day, then sporadic and brief. The conversations that used to run long and warm became transactional schedules, money transfers, school updates. When he was home, his body was present, but his attention had already left, and Michelle, who had always been able to read him like a book she had memorized, began feeling like a stranger was sitting across from her at the dinner table. She raised it with him directly, the way she raised everything, without drama and without cruelty. She told him she felt the distance growing. She told him the children were asking questions about why their father was always gone. She told him that a marriage could not survive on financial provision alone, that she had not agreed to raise 2 children by herself while he performed a life for people who did not love him. He heard the words. He apologized. He promised to do better. And then he went back out into the world and did the same things again, because the world out there was loud and flattering and required nothing from him except to show up, and home required everything, and he was no longer willing to give it. What Michel could not yet see was that the distance had a second layer, one far more damaging than absence. By his third year of international travel, Daniel Carter was not simply neglecting his marriage, he was betraying it. The first women were professional contacts in cities far enough from Dayton that the risk felt manageable, and he assembled the lies that unfaithful men always assemble with remarkable speed, that it meant nothing, that it was the nature of the lifestyle, that he was still a good father and a good provider, and that what happened in other cities was simply the cost of operating at his level. He told himself those lies with the same conviction he had once used to make promises at an altar, and they held together just long enough for him to move to the next betrayal. He stopped coming home on time. Then he stopped coming home at all for stretches that grew from days into weeks. And then he did something that crossed a line from which there was no quiet return. He brought women into the house that he and Michel had built together. Not once, but on more than one occasion, with a casualness that was, in some ways, more disturbing than the act itself, as if the home his wife had made with care and intention was simply a location on a map rather than the center of a family's life. He brought his new friends into that home too, men he had met in business circles in various cities, men with no roots in his real life and no investment in what happened to it, who showed up on his porch and drank his liquor and left the house smelling like cigarettes and poor decisions, who treated the space his children slept in like a venue for someone else's entertainment. And through all of it, Michel warned him. She did not warn him once. She warned him repeatedly, with the stubborn love of a woman who refused to stop fighting for her family, even when the person she was fighting for had stopped deserving it. "I have warned you several times about this lifestyle," she told him, her voice carrying the particular tremble of someone who is running out of ways to say the same true thing to someone who will not hear it. "I have warned you about the people you are bringing around, about what this is doing to your children and to me. One day, you are going to look around and realize what you have done." He heard the words every time. He did not hear the warning, not once. Not until the warning had long since become a reality he could not escape. He missed Marcus's school play. He sent money as an apology, because money was the language he had learned to speak in the place of presence. He missed Amara's birthday dinner and called late from a different time zone and sang her happy birthday in a voice slightly blurred from a long evening, and his daughter accepted it because children love their fathers with a generosity that far exceeds what most fathers earn. Michel held the household together with both hands and her own career, and whatever remained of her hope, doing the work of two parents while the man who had promised to be her partner was somewhere else entirely, performing a life that looked like success from the outside and was hollow at its center. She was running out of warnings. She was running out of the kind of patience that is sustained by hope rather than habit. And somewhere in those years, without announcing it, without a dramatic moment or a final argument, the hope began to run low. The illness did not arrive with any announcement. That is always how the most serious things come quietly, without ceremony, in the ordinary course of a life that has been moving too fast to notice what is accumulating. Daniel had been ignoring the signs for months. The weight loss he attributed to travel, the fatigue that a full night of sleep could not resolve, he attributed to the pace of his schedule. The pain that showed up and did not leave, he attributed to stress and age and the ordinary cost of operating at high speed. He cut back on drinking, and the symptoms did not ease. He pushed through 3 more international trips on will alone, and then his body made the decision that his judgment had been refusing to make. A colleague in Atlanta found him barely able to stand after a morning meeting and drove him to an emergency room. And after days of tests, a physician sat across from him with the measured calm of a professional who has delivered difficult news many times before, and told him that his body was failing in a way that was serious, and that the life he had been living was no longer an option, and that the road ahead was going to be long and would require everything he had. Daniel Carter sat in that hospital bed in Atlanta, a city where he had spent years being the most important man in every room, and for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, he was simply afraid. He picked up his phone. He scrolled past all of them, the women, the contacts across 3 continents, the friends who had been on his porch until 4 in the morning, and he called his wife. Not one of those women sent a message. Not a single one of the men who had benefited from his hospitality picked up the phone to ask how he was doing. His phone, which had buzzed almost without pause for years, went silent in a way that felt less like peace and more like exposure. The quiet that arrives when the last layer of distraction is removed, and what remains is the truth about who actually cares, whether you live or die. None of them came. No messages, no concern, just silence from every direction the world had promised would matter. Except one. Michelle answered the phone. She listened without reminding him of what he had done, without the satisfaction that would have been entirely justified, without anything except the calm practicality of a woman who has already decided who she is. 2 days later, she was on a flight to Atlanta with his insurance documents and his medical history, and a bag packed for an indeterminate stay, because she had made a promise in Columbus, Ohio, on a gold-leaved October afternoon, and she was not the kind of woman who unmade her promises even for a man who had repeatedly unmade his. The 2 years that followed were the most humbling of Daniel Carter's life. The illness required sustained care, medication schedules, dietary restrictions, regular specialist appointments, and the kind of physical vulnerability that a man who has spent years projecting invincibility finds almost unbearable to navigate. He could not travel. He could not work at the pace that had defined his identity for a decade. The performance was over, and what remained when the performance stopped was simply the truth of his life. The home he had neglected, the wife he had betrayed, the children who deserved better, and the complete silence coming from every direction he had spent his best years running toward. His biological brothers called in the early weeks and expressed their concern and told him to reach out if he needed anything, and they meant it. But as the crisis settled from acute into chronic, and life reasserted its ordinary demands on everyone around him, the calls came less frequently, and then less frequently still, the way it always goes, because people have their own lives, their own pressures, their own mornings to get through. His brothers came and went, as brothers do, but Michelle did not come and go. She stayed for every day of those 2 years, every morning, every difficult night, every appointment where she sat beside him and wrote down what the doctors said when he was too overwhelmed to absorb it himself. She managed the children through all of it, shielding them as much as she could while still being honest with them in the ways that children deserve. Marcus stepped up quietly without being asked, with the maturity of a boy who has watched his mother carry more than she should and decided to take on some of the weight. Amara brought drawings and read to her father in the evenings, curling up beside him with a library book and narrating it in the earnest voice of a child who understands, at some level beneath language, that love is demonstrated and not simply claimed. It was on an unremarkable Tuesday morning that Daniel Carter finally understood what he had nearly lost. He was lying in bed in the exhaustion particular to a man whose body has been at war with itself for a long time, and Michelle came in with a cup of water and adjusted his pillow with the practiced ease of someone who has learned every small adjustment that makes a difference. She stood at the door for a moment afterward, looking at him, and he looked back at her with eyes that were finally fully open. He saw all of it in her face. The love that had survived things it should not have survived. The hurt that had been accumulating for years and had never been adequately addressed. The exhaustion of a woman who had been doing this largely alone for longer than anyone should have to. The stubbornness of someone who had decided that her commitment meant something even when his had not. "Please help me, my love," he said, and the words came out stripped of everything except their truth. And she looked at him the way she had looked at him across a kitchen table years before, but with everything that had happened between that table and this bed written clearly in her expression. And she said, "Help you? Can't those your side chicks help you? Can't those your friends help you? Have you seen it now?" He swallowed hard and said nothing, because there was no answer to that question that would mean anything. Because the silence from the rest of the world had already answered it more completely than any words he could offer, she walked into the room slowly. "I have warned you several times," she said, her voice carrying that particular tremble of someone who has been right about something for a very long time and takes no pleasure in it, "about the lifestyle, about the choices, about what you were doing to this family, and you never listened. Now tell me, have you seen that you have no one else except me?" He nodded, slowly, and for the first time, the truth of it landed in him the way it had been trying to land for years. Tears gathered in his eyes as he looked at her. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking in a way that voices break when a person has finally run out of the distance they have been putting between themselves and the truth. "I didn't see it then, but I see it now." She did not respond immediately. She stood there measuring his words against years of pain, the way a person does when they have heard promises before and know the difference between words that cost something and words that cost nothing. Then, slowly, she walked closer. "You hurt me," she said quietly. "You broke this home, but I am still here, not because you deserve it, but because I once loved you deeply." Her words went deeper than anything the illness had done to him. She adjusted his pillow. She placed a cup of water on the nightstand. And then she said the words that he would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of. "This is the last time I will stand like this for you. If you want this family, you will change." He nodded again, this time with tears rolling freely, not the tears of a man who is performing remorse, but the tears of a man who has finally seen clearly what he almost destroyed and understands, in his bones, how close he came to losing the only person who truly stayed. The recovery was long on both fronts, the medical one and the other kind. There are no shortcuts through the damage that years of repeated betrayal leave in a marriage. Trust is not a switch. It is rebuilt the same way it was originally built, slowly, through consistent action, through showing up when leaving would be easier, through the accumulation of small kept promises that gradually begin to tell a different story. Daniel committed to that rebuilding the way he had once committed to his career, because he finally understood what he was actually working for. He found a therapist. He was honest, genuinely, rigorously honest about the insecurity beneath the ego, about the fear that had driven him away from the realest things in his life toward the things that glittered but did not hold. He came back to his marriage not as a man performing a better version of himself, but as a man who had been taken apart and put back together differently, more honestly, with less performance and more presence. And Michelle, with the patience of a woman who had always believed her husband was still in there somewhere beneath the noise and the choices, began slowly, carefully, without rushing anything to let him back in. Now hear this clearly, because this is the part of the story that matters most. There are men watching this right now who recognize the shape of what Daniel Carter lived, not necessarily every detail, but the pattern. The pattern of treating the people who love you unconditionally as if that love requires nothing in return. Of confusing a good woman's loyalty with an inability to leave when the truth is she is staying not because she has no options, but because she believes in what you built together more than you currently do. Of looking up one day when the noise has stopped and the phone has gone quiet and the world has moved on to its next entertainment, and finding silence in every direction except one. The research on this is not complicated. Study after study on long-term human well-being reaches the same conclusion that the quality of our close relationships is the single strongest predictor of health, happiness, and how a person looks back on their life at the end of it. Not career achievement, not financial accumulation, not professional status or the size of a network, or the number of cities a man has moved through. The people who show up when things fall apart. The people who stay when staying costs something. Those people are the architecture of a real life, and neglecting them in favor of things that feel more significant in the short term is not building something larger. It is hollowing out the only foundation capable of holding everything else up. To any man watching this, who is somewhere in the middle of his own version of this story, who is coming home too late or not at all, who is giving his best hours and his real attention to people and places that would not notice if he disappeared tomorrow, whose wife has been warning him in the quiet, persistent way of someone who is running out of ways to say the same true thing, hear this. The patience of a good woman is not infinite. The trust of children does not rebuild automatically. The home a woman holds together with both hands while her husband chases everything that does not love him back will eventually reach a point of no return, and it will not send a notification before it gets there. It will happen in the slow accumulation of broken promises and missed moments and 1,000 small betrayals of the ordinary kind, until the distance is too wide to cross without extraordinary grace. Daniel Carter was given that grace. His wife stayed. His children stayed. For 2 full years of illness, through every difficult month and every setback and every day when the road forward was unclear, they stayed, not because he had earned it, because they chose to. And he spent the rest of his life honoring that choice by becoming the man who deserved it. Put your family first, not after the next deal, not after the next trip or the next season or the moment when your life becomes more convenient for the people who have been waiting without any guarantee that they will keep waiting. Now, in the ordinary Tuesday of your regular life, come home when you said you would come home. Sit at the table and put the phone down and give the people across from you the attention that belongs to them. Know what is weighing on your wife this week. Know what is worrying your children right now, not in a general way, but specifically, the way a present parent knows. Choose your family in the small ways again and again and again, because those small choices are what a life is actually made of. And the man who discovers that too late would give back every city he has ever been in, every contact in his phone, every night out, and every expensive moment of the lifestyle he spent years building, for one ordinary evening at a kitchen table with the people who stayed. Your family is not the background to your life. Your family is the point of it. Everything else is noise. Do not wait until everything has gone quiet to finally hear that. Before we go, drop a comment right now and let us know where in the world you are watching from. We love hearing from every one of you. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Thank you for watching. Go home. Stay home. Your family is worth more than anything the world out there is offering.